Thank you all for coming. This is our very first race-approved continuing education course, and I'd just like to make some announcements before we get started. I will send a link to a survey near the end of the lecture and then after you fill out the survey, you'll receive a CE certificate that you'll have to fill in your name and your state and your license number. That will also add you to a spreadsheet that I will send in to the race program. And I thought that this meant that you get credit if you log your CE via racetrack. So automatically get recorded. Sometimes you have to upload your CE certificate and put it in by hand. So watch for that survey near the end of the lecture, fill that out, and that way we are sure you'll get your CE certificate and might put you in the racetrack system. And I also would love to keep these CE events free. So everyone has access to this information, but it does cost around $200 to get race approval, and it takes a few hours of administration work to fill out the paperwork and upload it to the website and promote it and everything. So your donations are totally appreciated, so we can continue doing this. Most free CE, as you might know, is offered by industry, pharmaceutical companies, and other corporations because they have a financial incentive and it's kind of a sales thing. And as animal protection advocates, we lack the billions of dollars that those other corporations have. And we're just kind of working for the best interests of our patients and not for profit. But we need your help so that we get this animal-centered information out there in front of veterinarians. So I'll post the link to donate in the chat if you want to, and you can also donate via Venmo at our honor if you want. And I was also thinking about maybe doing sponsorships or something for future CE events. So I'll put my email in the chat if you're interested in maybe sponsoring a CE event in the future. Let me see, where's my chat here? But yeah, and I also, there's this survey that's going around that I would love for you all to fill out so that we have a lot of data. It's about veterinarians' opinions on various topics. That's the link to donate in the Venmo. So consider filling this survey out if you haven't already, so we can get as many veterinarians as we can to give us their opinion so we know where the veterinary community stands on various issues. And share it with your colleagues too, so that they fill it out. And I want to share that information widely, what percentage of veterinarians believe that we should ban declawing or ban ear cropping. I think those are important issues that we need to know. So yeah, for tonight's lecture, this is the perfect topic to introduce our CE series, since this is sort of how our honor started in early 2020 when COVID first hit. I posted on my public Facebook page a post saying that it's racist to blame the Chinese wet markets when our factory farms here in the United States pose the same threat. And my colleagues started reaching out saying, you really should shadow a livestock vet so you know what you're talking about. And I'm like, well, I grew up in a rural ag area. I was vice president of my 4-H club. I studied animal science at UC Davis. I think I know what I'm talking about. But I am a dog and cat and horse vet. I do pigs, I do chickens, and do bunnies on the side, but I'm primarily dog and cat. So I get it. I'd love to shadow a livestock vet and talk to them about their job. So I posted in a veterinary Facebook group that I wanted to shadow a livestock vet and was thoroughly attacked. They screenshotted this public Facebook post. They piled on and said I was a radical animal rights activist, that I was going to secretly record people. And I was kicked out of all of these Facebook groups. And a meme went around about me with this rainbow border saying, beware, Dr. Heath means nothing good for our profession. She's affiliated with the ALF and the ELF, which I was not. It was pretty scary at the time. I was, in tears. I was worried my reputation was ruined. And then we found a few months later a document FOIA'd from the USDA Agriculture Marketing Service. This email sent around by the Animal Ag Alliance to all of their veterinary colleagues, saying that beware that, and they screenshotted this Facebook post that I made about the Chinese wet markets. And they said that my plans were to secretly record people and gather information I could use against the industry, and I should be blocked and all of that. So that I was on Glenn Greenwald's show, The Intercept, and the stories continued and snowballed from there. I'm still banned from many Facebook groups, veterinary Facebook groups, but it is what it is. But I think things are changing, and we've really shined a light on this horrible thing in our profession, and this bullying of our colleagues that really needs to stop. So I am so happy to bring Dr. Marek Muller, who is an assistant professor of communication studies at Texas State University with a specialization in arguments regarding animal welfare, animal rights, and ethics. They've published several articles on the subject, including a book, Impersonating Animals, which was published by the Michigan State University Press in 2020. And their work especially concerned with models of animal justice that intersect with human-centered movements surrounding equity, access, and inclusion. Since after all, we are all part of Kingdom Animalia. So take it away, Marek. Thank you so much for doing this.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. If it's all right, I think I'm going to start sharing my screen, but alas. And I just want to confirm, can everybody see this?
Looks great to me, yes.
All right, yeah. Fantastic. And here we go. So I've entitled my presentation for y'all today, and I use y'all because I'm from Texas. I don't know when that started. It just sort of started recently. Which meat is meat? Combating racialized, racist, and ethnocentric language during zoonotic disease outbreaks. So I really just want to do 4 things before we open it up to questions, comments, and concerns. The first is I would like to use my background as a rhetorician to introduce some linkages that exist between language, the moral emotion of disgust, and ethnocentric prejudices that often occur during zoonotic disease outbreaks, especially when risk is presented at a global level. Particularly, I'd like to explicate some very specific communication concepts such as framing, naming, and ideographs. Once you're familiar with how those function, I would like to use the 2014 to 2016 Ebola epidemic in East Africa as a guiding frame to understand how, in addition to what happened with COVID-19, biases are often embedded in seemingly benign discourses of biosecurity, conservation, and international development. And to conclude, I'd like to offer some socially responsible language strategies regarding meat and global zoonoses moving forward. But just to be clear from the start with who I am and who I am not a DVM veterinarian like yourselves. I have no intention of telling you what zoonoses is, how zoonoses happen, and best practices in avoiding zoonotic spillover effects. What I am is a rhetorician, which means I'm a communication scholar who studies arguments. I study how arguments form, how they're disseminated, how they're dispersed, and how often what is not said is just as important as what is said, and how often, even without meaning to, harmful ideologies can be promoted through seemingly innocent frameworks. But I'm also not a communication essentialist. It is not my goal in this presentation to tell you, you can say this, you can't say that. This style of communication is good, this style of communication is bad. What I believe is a model of communication dialectically, which doesn't take an either-or approach to communication, but more of a both-and, where something can simultaneously be true and it can simultaneously be harmful, where something can be good in one arena but harmful in another. So that when we look at communication as it happens, we have to evaluate each moment of communication within their broader socio-historical contexts. I'm also not a single issue scholar. I don't intend to talk to you today solely from the perspective of animal rights and liberation, but also not solely from the anthropocentric perspective that oftentimes does accompany communication presentations that are affiliated with DEIJA. I am somebody who believes that animal welfare, rights, and ethics are inextricably intertwined with issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and access. And I hope that becomes clear during this presentation. So as all of us were impacted by COVID-19, I think it becomes increasingly clear that if you watch the news, scroll through social media, you may have seen a particular group of people targeted as vectors of the global pandemic. And I think the images to the left-hand side of the screen are not foreign to a lot of you. There was a lot of concern promoted through media texts, through social messaging apps, and through some experts that perhaps the zoonotic spillover event that was to blame for the COVID-19 outbreak that became a global pandemic could be attributed to a phenomenon called a wet market centered in China. And sure, maybe indeed, wet markets did play some part in a spillover event. But an important factor of this discussion as it occurred during COVID-19 was consistently overlooked. And this quote from a historian at Auburn University, Dr. Froelich, I think illustrates beautifully what the issue was. Quote, "There is a long history of people seeking to blame pandemics on others. Past outbreaks have been attributed to the unhygienic poor. Disease is often racialized and used to blame racial minorities. And this is not the first time an epidemic has been blamed on a seemingly bizarre foreign cultural practice in order to make the epidemic about other cultures and not our own. It also diminishes our ability to learn from epidemics. People who externalize the threat and perceive an epidemic as being caused by some outside force are less likely to take measures to reduce their present risk or risk in the future. Indeed, one thing that has been absent in the reporting on this pandemic is how our own food production system contributes to the rise in zoonotic illnesses." And I believe it was at about this point that Crystal got screenshotted, so I hope that doesn't happen to me. But the thing about discourse surrounding COVID-19 and Chinese wet markets is that this was not a one-off event. And in fact, discussions of unsanitary, diseased, or just too foreign dietary practices often come up when risks of potential pandemic emerge, especially when those risks and their immediate zoonotic spillover events originate in a place that is not your own. In fact, my own research has focused on the outbreak of Ebola from 2014 to 2016, which actually stayed pretty centered in East Africa, but panic was so widespread through English language media that there were a variety of media articles and expert discourses that were concerned with, much like COVID-19, how local dietary practices that were perhaps unsanitary and perhaps did not eat the right meat could have contributed to the spread and would be to blame if, in fact, Ebola did reach the United States of America. COVID-19 and Ebola did share some similarities. Both were zoonotic. They spread rapidly. COVID became a global pandemic. Ebola did not, but there was mass fear of it becoming one. The media coverage of a non-Western vector centered on unsanitary dietary practices. For COVID, a Chinese wet market. But for Ebola, it was the African bushmeat trade. For many who consumed English language media for COVID, there was disgust over the practice of wet markets, particularly images shown of people eating what we would consider sometimes to be vermin, like a bat, or pets, like a dog. With Ebola, there was often discussed over the practice of hunting charismatic megafauna. Oftentimes, a picture of a primate would be on the cover of articles, as well as the prototypical picture of a rat or a bat or other types of vermin being consumed. For many, there was a refusal to look inward as the disease was externalized. Media and politicians often used these markets for fear mongering and clicks. And what we really want to focus on here are the communicative processes of externalization that not only contributed to misidentifying potential vectors, but overemphasizing another vector through a racialized lens. So like COVID-19, bushmeat markets received media coverage disproportionate to their likely influence in the spread of Ebola, and this coverage implicitly and at times explicitly portrayed East African meats as unclean, unhygienic, and uncivilized. Bushmeat is, after all, usually associated with going out into the quote unquote wild and using traditional hunting methods to hunt non-livestock animals and bring them to open air markets to trade. And perhaps the most infamous example of English language media concern over the East African bushmeat trade during Ebola was in this Newsweek article in 2013. You'll notice that juxtaposed next to this image of a primate is a picture of actually East African immigrants who were living in the United States and participating in what we are told to believe is an illegal underground bushmeat trade in America. The article opens as follows. We are here today looking for bushmeat, the butchered harvest of African wildlife, and an ethnic delicacy in West African expatriate communities all over the world. A turbaned woman smiles vividly when we enter one small market with canned goods displayed in its window, but the light in her eyes immediately dims when we ask about bushmeat. Shrugging, looking away, she says she knows nothing about it, and then after a moment's calculation, asks us to repeat the word as if she didn't understand what we had just said. So here in this opening, we see an immediate connection between illegal, potentially, criminal, potentially, but certainly unsanitary practices being brought from a foreign land into America in a manner that could potentially spread a global disease, not accidentally, but purposely, because people simply just want to eat their wrong meats. Why it's important to look at articles like this is because media frames are fundamental to how we make connections through language. Framing is a natural and normal cognitive process that connects concepts and helps humans make sense of phenomena. I like to explain it to my students that at any given moment, we have about 2 trillion stimuli coming into us at any given moment. And if we didn't make connections and find patterns and find ways to organize those stimuli, our heads would literally explode. So what we try to do is find patterns in our world, narratives in our world that are coherent and that make sense. And one of the ways that this is done in 2023 is through the consumption of media. Media frames are frameworks that repeat and dominate, especially as they're disseminated through storytelling platforms with the help of selected experts. And what we're looking for when we find if a media frame has become a master media frame, a popular media frame, a powerful media frame, is the extent to which when we open the story, we're able to pretty much predict where it's going to go and not find a lot of problems with it. A plus B naturally leads to C, which is a form of what narratologists would call narrative coherence. So why do we care about framing within the context of zoonotic disease outbreaks? Well, I would like to put framing in conversation with another communication concept you need to know about called ideographs. Ideographs are a discursive link between an argument and an ideology. A very simplistic way to think about them is as a buzzword, a highly politicized term that's repeated so often and for so long and with such vigor that we can actually lose sight of the years of historical baggage that is poured into the term. The most common ideographs we tend to think of are very abstract words that don't have a very clear, coherent definition. Freedom, American dream, free speech. We can always kind of know what they mean, but it's that abstraction that gives them their power. When audiences encounter an ideograph, therefore, they're less impacted by the dictionary definition of a term. They're impacted because of how an ideograph makes them feel, which for a rhetorician would be called the Greek concept of pathos. Now, as I said, ideographs are normally abstract concepts, but recently scholars have also suggested that they can be material objects, which we call representational ideographs that carry with them synecdochic value. When I say synecdochic value, what I mean is the material object, the slice of bushmeat, for example, is literally a slice of bushmeat. But within the language for bushmeat lies years of history, years of ideas about who eats what is meat, who is clean, who is not, what is sanitary, what is not, and who is civilized and who is not. So how do food-based ideographs make us feel? Well, it depends on how they're used. But when food-based ideographs are used as a villain, as a vector, as big bad, they can make us feel disgusted. So when we look at terms like wet market, when we look at terms like bushmeat, we have to evaluate critically the power that comes with a name. Names are, yes, merely descriptors, but when put into their larger context, they can often reveal things like geographic biases, race or ethnic-oriented ideologies. You can't just take the name at face value. There's things behind the name, in much the same way that you can't take my name at face value. I'm not just Marek Muller. I'm a lot of other things. And you need to know a lot of those things about me before you can really know what it means to be Marek Muller. So when I talk about the politicization of names, particularly within the context of media frames and ideographic language, we can always, of course, use the animal welfare advocate's favorite example of pick your protein. Which of these three animals is meat? Which of these is bushmeat? Why? Well, the fact of the matter is, the why is simply that naming is a political act. The act of a name is an act of categorization. As literary theorist Kenneth Burke has explained, language is something that simultaneously selects, reflects, and deflects reality. Put simply, at the moment you give something a category, you invite perceptions of what a thing is within that categorization, but at times can also leave out other ideas if they do not fit within that category. So when we frame animal flesh, when we name certain meats as meat, when we use ideographic language that imbues synecdochically a lot of these words with ideology, we need to identify a process that really happens in this order of three. First thing that can happen, at least in times of zoonotic disease outbreak, is the naming of a food as a potential vector. And that's something that should happen because zoonotic diseases are named as such because they are based from animal sources. It is not wrong to identify animal vectors of a disease. It needs to happen. It's also not wrong to identify food sanitation practices that might contribute to zoonoses. The trouble becomes, after the naming of a food as a vector, the identification of that food as a non-food. Because when we identify non-food as consumed, a particular emotion is often triggered, and this emotion is disgust. What's important to understand about disgust is that it is a moral emotion. Moral emotions are based off of our norms, perceptions, biases, ideas about what is right, what is wrong, what is just, what is unjust. Moral emotions are extremely powerful, especially as we approach communication, because when disgust manifests in our language, it can reveal prejudices embedded in our language, and in this case, through food consumption. And what happens even more is that once disgust is triggered, at times, our loaded language poses an exaggeration of vector risk. An epidemiological desire to find a patient zero is something that always happens during a zoonotic disease outbreak, as does the psychological desire to attribute blame. The risk becomes, though, the simplistic portrayal of germs to a non-food item, to the eating of the non-food item, to the disease, to the spreading of the disease. Because while that literally could be the process by which zoonosis has occurred, we have to be very careful that we're not engaging in the narrative wherein the more foreign the disease, the non-food, the more overstated the vector risk, and the more understated pertinent other risks. Indeed, and when studying Ebola, I personally identified three master frames used by experts and pundits that problematically gave bushmeat's ideographic power and othered African food systems in an unhelpful way. For example, the frame of biosecurity was often used. And once again, under the frame of biosecurity, oftentimes there was a process of linguistics externalization. These others are engaging in unsanitary practices and will bring those practices over capital H here. And you can see here where the moral emotion of disgust through the consumption of bushmeat led to another moral emotion of indignation, much like in that Newsweek article. It's upsetting that me here sitting innocently in my country eating real food would be exposed to a disease by these criminalized populations who just can't eat like the rest of us. But a counterpoint, vectors are multiple and multidirectional, including healthcare workers to African citizens. Framing is often used in connection with anti-immigration master frames, and zoonotic disease is already here by our own design. We could think merely of E. coli outbreaks or the infamous mad cow disease scare of so many years ago. Another frame that tends to occur that seems really innocent at the start, but ends up actually promoting more ethnocentric language was a conservation frame. Those others are killing and selling off non-food animals as food, and it's not right. Which, obviously, as somebody who cares very deeply about animal lives, I don't much care for it either. But what we see here is the moral emotion of disgust turning into horror. Horror at the thought that the wrong animals are being consumed for food. Counterpoints, though, deforestation and multinational corps bring wild fauna into close contact with humans. And it's through this contact that we actually see a lot of the elimination of species. Charismatic megafauna, like the monkey that is so clearly highlighted on that Newsweek article, they're actually not the typical bushmeat food of choice. Those would be cane rats or other things we might consider to be vermin, which again is a politicized category. But you see here the idea of the charismatic megafauna being the victim of an uncivil hunter. It's an overstatement. Cruel hunting and slaughter practices, by the way, are not a uniquely African phenomenon. Game hunting is an extremely popular hobby with many populations globally. And finally, I identified a frame for international development, which had an externalizing thesis that if those others practice modern and Western meat safety protocols, this wouldn't happen. Moral emotions in language here went from disgust with bushmeat trades to pride in Western industrial systems. Counterpoints, industrialized agriculture does cause environmental degradation and accompanying health risks for those who live next to it. Agriculture animals displace local flora and fauna, and developed regulatory bodies like the FDA aren't all that great at snuffing out unsanitary practices. We see these through animal rights violations and the understaffing of FDA investigators. But it's all well and good to point out all the problems that we saw during COVID, that I saw during my studies of Ebola. But really what we need to care about is how to move forward with responsible discussion of zoonotic disease vectors, because as we likely are aware, it's only a matter of time until the next one comes. So here's what we probably shouldn't do. Blame simplistically dietary practices of capital O others for zoonoses. We should not simplistically use bushmeat, wet markets, other representational ideographs as cloaks for racially or nationally prejudiced attitudes toward food consumption. What we have to do is acknowledge how local and global food systems carry increasing zoonotic risks, especially as factors such as overdevelopment, industrialized agriculture, and climate change bring non-human animals increased likelihood of zoonotic spillover. And we need to acknowledge every person's, ourselves included, potential complicity as a vector for zoonotic spread. Why should we do this? Because food and ideas of edibility impact disgust. But disgust is a moral emotion that necessitates moral language. With moral language, we need to be so careful to avoid simplistic us versus them narratives that are so often provoked and exacerbated by master frames such as biosecurity, conservation, development. Frames that are very okay to use, since we should care about biosecurity, we should care about conservation, and we should care about development. But zoonoses themselves are not foreign entities, and we must acknowledge that global changes and local changes are necessary to combat the next pandemic. More radically, however, perhaps what we should be doing is defamiliarizing, unnaming, and renaming concepts of food and meat in general. Indeed, when psychologist Melanie Joy coined the term carnism and critiqued the idea of capital M meat as capital N natural, normal, and necessary, she proposed that actually quite a few of our perceptions of food systems, foodiness, and even disease might change when our evaluation of things like, for example, zoonotic disease risk. I mean, how would that change when it's not prima facie assumed that meat would be on the menu? What would a radical revisioning of global food systems look like in starting in our own cultural contexts? So what I'm trying to say is it's ridiculous for me to say, don't ever talk about bushmeat. Don't ever talk about wet markets. You can't blame them for anything. They're totally innocent. That's not accurate. But what I'm saying is the responsible thing to do is not to simplistically villainize over there. You need to look to your fridge, your town, your own complicity in zoonotic spread, and use that as a guiding framework to more responsibly contextualize zoonoses within a global food systems framework. And I would be happy to direct you to some research that I find particularly helpful on this subject as a communication scholar myself. And I will unshare my screen.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. That was so interesting. You should like definitely do a podcast. Like, please host a podcast. I loved that. It's so interesting to me too, looking back at the FOIA documents we've received from the pork board, how they wanted to change the language around ventilation shutdown, which was the mass killing in 2020 of pigs, especially via heat stroke. When executive was like, McDonald's is starting to ask questions. We really need to change we really need to come up with a new name for this. And so it's how we name things is so political. So there is a couple of questions in the chat. One is, do you think that the term bushmeat is a racist term? Maybe, and she says, maybe you'll answer this during your presentation. I don't know, like, how do you feel about that?
So I have a lot of discussions with this in the communication field because there's not really a consensus on what makes a term harmful. Me personally, I think that no individual term is inherently racist. I think that terminologies are used racistly. Bushmeat is not used all the time as a pejorative. It's not used to hurt others, but the way that it is used in particular contexts oftentimes does perpetuate ideologies that harken back to this idea of, for example, African peoples as othered, harkens back to those times where African natives were actually barred from having guns, whereas colonists were allowed to have them because it was assumed that the colonists would hunt civilly and the colonized would be uncivil. So do I think it's a racist term? No. But do I raise my eyebrows when somebody uses it without context? Sometimes.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another just DEIJA question mark. I guess.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry. So there's a million different acronyms for diversity, equity, inclusion, which is very often accused of being a corporatized buzzword. So the one that I've adopted is DEIJA, which stands for diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and access. Access includes disability in the conversation, and justice accounts for the fact that it's not enough to just say we want to be diverse. You actually have to walk the walk in addition to talking the talk. But I apologize. I should have briefed you from the start why I was using that acronym.
Cool. Thank you. Any other questions that aren't in the chat, or anybody want to raise their hand? Yeah, Joanne?
No, I just want to discuss the bushmeat term. So I've done a lot with zoonotic diseases, and bushmeat it's always the term. And yet we don't think of, right now I'm in Vermont, going out and killing a deer as bushmeat. And I think there is a connotation to it. I mean, I stopped actually in the middle of a lecture and said, I don't think I should be using this term because of the implication that it's African, and it's somehow it's worse than killing a deer and eating that, which many people in the United States do. And I think it is used in a pejorative way, even in scientific circles, not just in popular press. So I just wanted to make that comment. I think calling it racist is a little bit too simplistic, but we don't apply the term to ourselves, certainly, and so I think that's yeah. Anyway, okay.
Yeah.
Well, maybe just a comment. This is Dana. Instead of using it less, maybe we need to use it more broader, because it really does include antelope in Africa, which is similar to deer here and stuff. I mean, I see nothing wrong with calling hunting for deer the same as hunting for bushmeat and rabbits.
Yeah,
Right,
especially
but we
there's
don't.
crossover. There's crossover with which animal is actually hunted in a place like
Right.
the US and the place like Africa. I mean, rabbits would count for both, you know, but one's bushmeat and one's not.
But I think
Well,
we usually,
would
oh, go
it
ahead.
still be? Wouldn't rabbits, wouldn't people hunt squirrels? They'll hunt possum. Aren't those all just bushmeat by definition?
Should.
Or are they forest meat because we don't have the bush like you do in Australia or Africa?
Yeah.
Maybe that's it. Maybe that's it. Okay, thanks.
Is
I-
that the
yeah.
origin of the like bush, like as in the African bush specifically?
I believe that that's the origin. Yeah, it's one of those terms, like it has an initial definition, and sometimes words change over time and expand over time and like contract over time. And my call usually is more not to stop using a word, but to change the uses of the word, unless that word is always and already damaging and used to harm. But I could totally understand the perspective of saying, you know what, there's no reason for me to use this. It's just game. I'm going to use game because it's just game.
Yeah, I would have said that when I heard the first time I heard bushmeat, I would have said it was from clearing land, and the people that were clearing the land had to hunt the local animals, or did hunt the local animals, most particularly with chimpanzees. So that's how I knew the term, but it's a great point. And I think that we shouldn't be using it anymore since it seems to be spread to just basic hunting.
Mhm. Cool. Any other questions from anybody?
I should turn on my camera so you can say, this is Dana again, and kind of on that same link. One question, one thing that's always, I've been wondering a long time with the COVID is, where did wet market come from? I mean, what does that mean? Is that a term used in Asia, or is it only in the US? And what does it encompass?
You know, I'll be honest, I genuinely have no idea, but there's an amazing paper by a scholar named David Rooney who does an investigation into the language surrounding wet markets. And I would be happy to send that around because I believe Rooney actually delves into that.
Okay, thank you.
And
I
feel
actually
free to
have a,
send me an email, or unless Marek, you want to share your email, I'm happy to connect people.
Oh, no, I'll share my email as long as it's cool. Hold on.
Yeah.
TexasState.edu.
so Marek, the wet markets, I think it's only ever referred to markets where meat and other things are sold in Asia. But we do have those same kinds of markets here, and they're called wet markets because there's blood, there's guts, there's there's all kinds of secretions and things like that spill out into the floor. People are there, they're sneezing. It's just, there's a lot of stuff all swimming around, a lot of bacteria and other kinds of things swimming around in a very liquid, mass on the floor. And so, but we do have those. I mean, in Chinatown, in Massachusetts, in Boston, there are wet markets, and yet I don't know that we call them live bird markets.
Yeah, we have some here in Oakland and in San Francisco and Stockton. And I know activists refer to them as wet markets. When we are doing legislation around them, they're referred to as wet markets, but I don't think they're like advertised as wet markets necessarily either.
What about like the fish market in San Francisco? That's kind of a wet market.
Yeah, and they sell like turtles and
They cut them open and clean them there and stuff. So, yeah. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, really interesting stuff. Dr. Muller has done a whole bunch of really interesting academic articles that you should check those out. And maybe you'll do another talk soon about one of your other articles as well. So really awesome job. This is so fun and so exciting. And it's so good to hear about things that we don't normally hear about in veterinary continuing education courses. And our next talk is coming up, I think, on November 8th on fish welfare with Dr. Catalina Lopez. So come check that out. And we'll see you all then. This will be posted to our YouTube channel, our honors YouTube channel, and probably on all our social media. So follow us there. And don't forget to fill out the survey to get your CE certificate. If you have any questions, to email me at info@ourhonor.org. And yeah, hope to see you next time. Thank you all for coming. And y'all have a good night.